A well-publicized story out of England caught our attention. It's about a toddler who said he was the reincarnation of a World War II German bomber pilot. The details he provided when he was just 3 years old are so specific, they'll make you ask, could it be? A young English boy plays a waltz by Johann Strauss. Could it be that this music was a soundtrack from a previous life in another land?
What particularly intrigued me about Carl's case was his unusual behavior at a very young age.
And what intrigued us was the possible connection between Carl Edon's strange behavior and a discovery after his untimely death. Could it be Carl was the reincarnated soul of another man? From the very beginning, Carl Edon was different. Born in 1972, he was the third child of Val and Jim Edon of Middlesbrough, England.
He was the most difficult of them all as children. Awkward. So much so that I used to say to him, if I can find out where you belong, I'm sending you back. He drove me absolutely crackers.
Carl was different from the other members of family. His brother had dark hair and dark eyes. Carl had strawberry blonde hair, blue eyes.
Yes, Carl was different, but it was what he said as soon as he could talk that really made people wonder.
He started to come up with sort of things like, I died before, I crashed my plane into a window, as he used to say. And of course, we didn't take much notice of that. We thought it was daydreams or boys' fantasies.
Then, at 3 years of age, Carl Edon made a startling statement. He said he used to be a pilot in the German Air Force, a pilot who crashed his plane after a bombing mission in World War II. All of this sounded far-fetched, coming from a toddler, but according to Dr. Ian Stevenson, the director of personality studies at the University of Virginia, Carl's claims were consistent with other reincarnation cases he studied.
References to the other family, the parents, are quite common in these cases. And Carl seemed to have a fairly clear image of another mother.
I felt strange when he did mention about his other mother. But he described her as being plump and very, very bossy, with this very dark hair that she pulled back at the back of her head. But when he was quite naughty, I used to threaten to send him back to her.
Stevenson and his team began studying Carl's case in 1983. They were fascinated by the pictures the little boy was drawing before the age of 5.
We used to notice that he was drawing mainly the cockpit of a plane with all the dials and gauges. And when we asked him about those, he would tell us, each and every one, what they were, where the bombs were let go from the floor. He always said he fired the bombs. That was his words for it.
Carl's father, Jim, wondered so much about his son's unbelievable claims that he decided to do some research of his own.
And I'm trying all the time to catch him out, to fault him. And he came out with, he said to me, he used to fly, I think he said a Messerschmitt 110. And I said, well, you failed there, Carl, because a Messerschmitt, as far as I was concerned, was a fighter plane. And I called at the library on the way home from work and looked up a book on German aircraft of the last war. And basically, the plane he'd said was a bomber. And he said he always used to fly a bomber.
What made Carl's recollections even more interesting to researchers was the fact that the 5-year-old had virtually no access to information about Germany or World War II.
There's no way he could have picked any information up in the house. I was born after the war. I wasn't a great watcher of war films. I didn't have any war books or war planes in the house.
According to Carl's mother, the one time the family did watch a film about World War II, Carl immediately pointed out the movie's factual errors.
There was one night we were all sitting watching a war film, and Carl just piped up, He's like my sergeant when I was in the Air Force, but he's got the badge on the wrong side of his uniform. So we didn't say anything, but Jim was there, and he went to the library, had a look, and of course he was right. The badge was on the wrong side. There were so many things that pointed to it being right as time went on, and it was just so uncanny.
While Carl's stories already seemed beyond belief, it wasn't long before he made the most incredible statement of all. The youngster claimed he remembered his own violent death.
I crashed a plane into a building when I used to drive my plane. That was the way he used to say it. And he said he lost a leg and he bled to death.
By the time he was 9, Carl's astounding story was documented in a book about reincarnation. In one passage, Carl recounted in chilling detail his fatal crash. He said he was flying at low altitude and lost consciousness. He came to just in time to realize he was plummeting toward a building. He made a desperate effort to avoid the collision, but it was too late. He smashed through a plate glass window. After the book was published, English newspapers jumped on Carl's story. But according to his best friend, the publicity made Carl a target of ridicule.
Carl was treated differently at school. The other children used to mock him by calling him Hitler, Nazi, German pilot, and used to do the signs, the saluting, and said that he was making stories up just to get in newspapers.
And by the age of about 9 or 10, you just stopped talking about it.
Typically, as the children become older, they stop speaking spontaneously about the previous life, and sometimes you can't tell whether they've just, as we say, gone underground or have really forgotten.
So, was Carl Edon the reincarnated soul of a German pilot who crashed his plane in England in World War II? Whether or not you believe in reincarnation, the story of Carl Edon has been rather unusual so far. But the bizarre and unexpected turn it takes next is certain to make many of you wonder. When Carl Edon was a young boy in England, he shocked his friends and family by claiming he'd led a previous life as a German bomber pilot in World War II.
At first it struck me as strange because I never heard stories like this before from other friends.
It wasn't in jest or in fun. He was so serious about it, and he wanted people to take him serious about it. And obviously a lot of people didn't.
When Carl's story hit the newspapers, he was teased by his schoolmates.
People call him names, Hitler, Nazi, just names like that that mock him and try and bring him down.
By the time Carl grew up and had a child of his own, he stopped talking about the strange life he said he had lived before. Carl's parents and friends always hoped that someday he'd be able to explain his extraordinary past, but that day would never come. On a hot August night in 1995, Carl's life came to a violent end beside these railroad tracks.
When I learnt of Carl's death, I felt shocked. I felt numb.
During an argument with a co-worker, Carl was stabbed repeatedly. At the young age of 22, Carl Edon bled to death, just as he had predicted more than a decade earlier.
I felt numb because what Carl had told me in childhood, that he was going to die bleeding to death, and he won't live a very long life. He will die before he's 25.
As uncanny as it was that Carl foresaw the time and circumstances of his own death, his incredible story doesn't end there. 2 years after Carl's passing, authorities in Middlesbrough, England, found something that stunned them. Less than half a mile from the railroad tracks where Carl was killed, workers digging a pipeline unearthed a German bomber from World War II. Honorary German Consul John Knight helped oversee the excavation of the downed aircraft. He found himself deeply puzzled by the similarities between the newly discovered bomber and the stories Carl had told of his previous life.
I by no means am a great believer in the paranormal. At the same time, there are elements there to be explained, and I can't explain them.
John Knight wasn't the only skeptic drawn in by the growing mystery. Hans Mondorf, the German consul general for England, also found the story strangely compelling.
The workers discovered under a mound which was next to the railway lines a bomber plane from the Second World War, which had been shot down in January 1942.
1942. According to Val Edon, it was the very year that Carl said his previous life had come to an end.
Carl used to say that he died in 1942, and that was a big shock when we found that plane came down in 1942.
According to authorities, the plane had once carried a crew of 4. At the time of the crash, 3 bodies had been found.
That's the numbers identified, yeah.
Now, searchers discovered the last of the crew members. His name was Heinrich Richter.
They found indeed the remains of the 4th missing person, and that was reported to me in December 1997.
Was it really possible Carl Edon had some connection with this German bomber and the victim found inside? The coincidences were so startling, authorities began looking into Carl's claims.
He said that he had been on a mission over to England, had been shot down, and that he had bled to death in the remains of the plane.
When that plane came down, it came down nose first, and so the impact would have shattered all the glass front, and no doubt the crew would have all suffered from glass fragments and breakages around them.
Over and over through the years, Carl had described in detail the shattering of glass when his plane crashed to Earth. There was more. The age of the recovered victim was strikingly similar to Carl's at the time of his death.
The body whose remains we found now, Heinrich Richter, was 24 years of age.
And when Carl was murdered, he was only 22.
And sort of this sends a cold shiver down you.
That was very eerie, but amazing, to say the least.
The only solid bit of metal the bar seems to be is.
The next discovery was even more mysterious. Authorities found a ring that the German airman had been wearing. The ring bore the letter P. Was it possible that the ring belonged to someone in Heinrich Richter's family?
Carl always maintained he had a brother who was also in the Air Force but died before him, called Peter.
Authorities tried to reach the family of the German airman, but no relatives were found. As a result, he was buried in this cemetery in England. Carl's parents attended the funeral service.
We felt as though when we were at that second funeral, we were burying Carl again.
I remember that the wife saying to me, when we attended this German airman's funeral, that now we've put Carl to rest in his previous life as well as this life, and we hope that that will be the end to it now.
So was Carl Edon the reincarnated spirit of a German pilot? Those who are closest to this bizarre saga are still haunted by memories of the little boy who was sure he had lived once before.
I say I'm a skeptic, but I think at the end of the day, I recognise that there are an awful lot of strands which come together.
Something unexplainable remains which nobody can clarify. I can't tell you, of course, that Carl Edon was the reborn Heinrich Richter, but he was involved somehow in that story of the bomber crew and probably of Heinrich Richter.
I think it is quite possible that when the plane did crash, that Carl was in it, and he was reincarnated. I believe what Carl was trying to tell us was actually true.
If you're curious about whether reincarnation experiences run in families, Carl Edon's daughter has not reported any memories or dreams of past lives.